Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to our lecture on the topic of intelligence. Now, this particular lecture is going to be a little bit unique compared to some of the other ones that we've talked about so far, and that's because before we can start talking about the developmental concepts associated with the idea of intelligence, we first have to come to a consensus or an understanding of what intelligence exactly is, because there is a lot of debate in this field of cognitive psychology about just defining the concept of intelligence. To understand where this confusion comes, or where kind of the I guess debate about what intelligence is actually revolving around, I thought we'd start today's class off with another activity. So what I'd like you guys to do for the next few minutes is try to think of your own concept of intelligence. And what I'd like you to do is try to come up with some examples of where you could separate out an intelligent from what we might call a dull person. So maybe a written test or an interaction test or something else that you could use to define intelligence. Now, this might take you a few minutes to do. What you might see is that there's some overlaps between things, but there's a good chance that you might find some really different ways to look at this idea of intelligence. And once you've done that, I want you to advance to the next slide, and we'll talk about the implications of this activity. Yep. If you did that activity, I'm guessing you have 5 options or 5 tests that have some similarity, but I'm guessing that most people in the class probably came up with a variety of different things that aren't all perfectly overlapped with each other. And if we took everybody in the class and compared their examples of intelligence, what we'd probably see is there's a litany of different things that people can link to this idea of intelligence. In essence, intelligence is a very multifaceted thing. There's lots of different ways that we can separate out people's ability to process things or interact with their environment in an effective way. And that kind of complexity to this idea of intelligence is something that makes studying this particular topic exceptionally difficult, because one of the first things that we have to do within the field is come up with some type of a definition of intelligence that encompasses all the different types of things that we link to this idea. So when we look for a definition of intelligence, one of the best ones around is one that you see listed up in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, and it's called the ability, or we define intelligence as the ability to solve problems and adapt and learn from the environment. Now, this definition is exceptionally vague, but it's vague on purpose. We don't necessarily want to limit intelligence in these definitions to just social skills or the ability to kind of do a lot of problems on a problem set very quickly. Well, and that definition kind of allows for that. But a lot of people argue that even having that broad of a definition might not catch all the different types of intelligence out there. There's a belief that this definition maybe doesn't include the idea of creativity in its kind of base form. Interpersonal skills, the ability to kind of talk to people, to convey ideas, also doesn't necessarily fit under that spectrum of intelligence, and things that we think of as being really important for intelligence, having a huge vocabulary or having amazing memory capacity, it doesn't necessarily, by that definition, fit into this framework of what intelligence is. And because of that, even though we might have some idea before we even start studying it about what intelligence kind of looks like, or we can kind of spot it when we see it, finding a way to coherently define intelligence and finding a test to look at intelligence is something that's extremely difficult to do. This idea of comparing people's intelligences, looking at how we can really describe our change in intelligence as we age, was one of the first areas that people studying this topic of intelligence really struggled with. In essence, lots of people over many decades have tried to perfect this idea of something called an intelligence test, a way that we can measure some quantitative indicator of intelligence within a person and use those indicators to compare one person to another. Intelligence tests have gone through many revisions over the years. They've been perfected in different ways, or they've been altered to kind of fit new concepts of what intelligence is about. But one of the things that's really interesting to many people studying this idea of intelligence, and in particular intelligence tests, is that they haven't necessarily been around for a really long period of time, even though we've cared about intelligence for centuries. In fact, when we look back in the history of this topic of intelligence, what we see is that intelligence tests have actually been around for just about a century. And these intelligence tests have to be kind of attributed to one particular individual. It's an individual whose name you probably have heard before, but maybe not heard much of his situation. His name was Alfred Binet, and he was the very first person to develop an intelligence test, but he did it for a very unusual purpose. So people cared about intelligence long before Binet. They'd compare individuals, by talking about how much information they'd learned, or they'd find ways to kind of indicate, somebody's standing by looking at academic skills. But until Alfred Binet was tasked by the French Ministry of Education, we had no way of really testing this idea of intelligence across a broad spectrum of individuals. But in 1904, when his country was struggling with their educational systems, they were actually going through a lot of debt. Their government was really struggling to kind of meet the needs of all its people. So what they decided to do was find a way to kind of better their scholastic systems. One of the reasons that they thought education was a major problem was the fact that they seemed to have a ton of kids within their school systems that were causing kind of mismatches in the way that they could educate their children. They're spending a lot of time and resources trying to meet the needs of everybody. And in particular, they thought one of the major problems that they had is they had a bunch of kids going to these schools that weren't necessarily profiting from the traditional school setting, where there's a teacher and a bunch of students, and it's just kind of a lecture format where there's no involved interaction and there's no way to slow down the teaching process. And what the French ministry decided was that these children that were really struggling from this school system were dragging everybody down. They were causing the other students to not be able to get the information presented to them in a fairly fast manner. They were causing the teachers to have to dedicate all their time to these children. And these kids that were struggling because of the animosity that they experienced often didn't benefit from these school systems, even though they had kind of intentionally slowed themselves down for these children. So the French ministry asked a number of people, including Alfred Binet, to figure out a way to detect these children, to find these children so they could get them out of the school system into a kind of atypical or a non-traditional format so they could help these kids learn a lot better. And more importantly, they could also get the rest of their classmates, the rest of the school, to function more efficiently. And to do this, he decided to try to come up with a whole series of different tests to kind of compare the cognitive abilities of individuals across a spectrum of different ages. And these tests were meant to be fairly simple. They were just intended to kind of look at young children in their early years. So he would have in these tests very basic verbal tasks like touch your toes or point to your toes. He would ask them to do things like spell very simple words or define concepts, or he'd have them look at pictures and identify what the picture was indicative of, like a couch or a chair. But in these basic tests, what he was able to do was kind of set up a baseline for how most kids at a specific age would perform on these tests. So he would look at the vocabulary of kids at a specific age. He'd look at their ability to follow directions at a specific age. And he'd set kind of a standard for what the mental age of a specific performance was like. So we'd say your mental age is if you're acting like, say, a 4-year-old. And actually in these mental ages he operated on months, not years usually. But he'd say your mental age is blank months old. And what he would then do is take this child's mental age based on their performance and compare it to their actual physical age, their chronological age, so the number of months they were. And to calculate out the child's intelligence, what he did was create this quotient called the intelligence quotient, or the IQ, where he divided the child's mental age by their chronological age and multiplied that ratio by 100. If a child was normal, like everybody else, they would have an IQ of 100. If a child was exceptional, where their mental age exceeded everybody else's in their chronological age, they would have an IQ of, say, 150 or 200. You'd have really extreme scores in these tests sometimes. But if a child was really struggling, and these were the ones that he was interested in, they would have an extremely low IQ. So it'd be somewhere around 20 or 40 or 50 or even 60 would be kind of considered a little bit problematic. And these low IQs were what Binet used to really kind of tease out these children that weren't going to be really successful in their schools. And by creating this test, we really had our framework for how future intelligence tests would be designed. One of the first things that happens after these IQ tests were designed by Binet was they started picking up in popularity. In particular, many people, many miles from France, started becoming enamored with this idea of comparing one person to another. One of the first places where intelligence tests really became popular was in the United States, where a number of different researchers started trying to devise new and revised intelligence tests based on Binet's original design. And one of the more popular and actually still famous tests that came from Binet's early test was a test called the Stanford-Binet IQ test. And this IQ test was substantially different from Binet's in a number of different ways. One of the first ways it was different from Binet's original test was that it was in English. Binet's was entirely in French, and they didn't have an English version of the test simply because most of these tests were being administered in France for a specific group of children. But when this researcher named Louis Terman, who was actually working over at Stanford, started devising his test, one of the first things he did was he translated a lot of Binet's early research into English. Another thing he did was he removed the calculation of IQ based on a child's chronological age and mental age, and instead what he did was he standardized the test. And what that means is he took a whole bunch of kids at, say, 6 months, a whole bunch of kids at 10 months, a whole bunch of kids at 2 years of age, 4 years of age, and this actually extended up the scale in age. He actually went all the way up into teenagers in these tests, and he found the average performance of all of these kids, and he also figured out, which percentage of, say, 2-year-olds did a specific type of performance in comparison to their peers. So he knew what the average performance was, but he also knew what an above average performance was for a 4-year-old, and what a below average performance was. And what he wanted to do was essentially figure out which percentage of kids their age, a 4-year-old taking a test, did better than. So if a child did better than, say, 84% of all other 4-year-olds, then the child wouldn't score an IQ that was related to the mental age that they were close to, but instead it was related to the percentage of kids they did better than. So a child who did better than 84% of his classmates, as you see below, would get an IQ score of 115. And this new standardized method was very attractive to researchers because it gave a little bit more information about what we were looking at when we were trying to compare kids to another. And another thing that he did in this test was he kind of diversified the different things that were being tested. So he added some quantitative skill tests to it. He looked at visual spatial processing. He also measured memory for the very first time. And all of these ideas really broadened the scope of what this IQ test could actually measure. Now, one interesting note with this IQ test, which makes it kind of a more interesting story, was there was also another purpose behind Terman's invention of this Stanford-Binet test. Not only did he want to bring it to the States to kind of make himself popular, but he also wanted to bring it to the States to promote an idea that he and many individuals in kind of the upper echelon were trying to push in these kind of early 1900s. It was a concept of something called eugenics, which was this government-led idea where we could possibly systematically breed a country or a group of individuals that would be significantly superior to everybody around them. In essence, he argued that if we could find individuals with high IQ and pay them to have lots of children, and also find people with low IQs and pay them an exorbitant amount not to have children, we could create a culture in the United States that was significantly more intelligent, significantly more capable than a lot of other cultures. Now, there wasn't a lot of movement in this idea of eugenics. It never was really pushed to a point where it became a government enacted thing, even though there were some concerns that there were some groups, fringe groups, that did try to encourage it a little bit. The idea here was kind of interesting. That again, we see an intelligence test that was designed that people use still today, but it was designed for a very specific, kind of quirky, unusual reason. And that was, again, where intelligence tests really started. We got Binet trying to detect kids that were struggling, and then we have Terman trying to find ways to compare kids in the upper echelon to others so we could really kind of give those kids that were excelling extra incentives to kind of help the country or help the government proceed in a much more effective way. This idea of kind of a sinister approach to intelligence tests was eventually kind of stopped, slowed down by the research of a man named David Wechsler, who invented two of the most popular intelligence tests that we use today, especially in the clinical setting. David Wechsler invented both the WAIS, which is called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and the WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, which is for people up to age 16. And both the WAIS and WISC ask questions about a huge variety of pieces of information that we kind of link to intelligence. So some of the things like memory, verbal abilities, non-verbal skills like spatial understanding were really important. But another thing that he did, which made his test very unique, was he started incorporating tasks that had nothing to do with language or being able to follow directions. A great example of this type of testing is in the picture that you see depicted below, where he would give children or adults blocks that you see shaped down below and ask them to assemble them in ways that would replicate the shapes you see in the lower right-hand corner. And these types of tests, he thought, would really remove some of the cultural... Sorry about that. Some of the cultural... Oh, stop. Some of the cultural and gender and other types of language biases that we would sometimes see simply because of experiences or backgrounds that were kind of required for people to take the Stanford Binet and other tests. And because of that, the Wechsler scales gained in popularity in a way that many of the other tests that have been devised to test intelligence haven't. And in fact, for most clinics nowadays to test a person's intelligence, if they're looking at a child under the age of 16, they'll use the WISC, and if they're looking at an adult, they'll use the WAIS because of how diverse they are and how they kind of take into account some of the challenges that we saw in some of the previous tests that are out there. Now that we've covered the idea of different intelligence tests that we have, I do want to mention the fact that, when we look at these tests, we see some inherent assumptions, some inherent ideas about intelligence embedded with them that are really, really important. So when we look at intelligence tests, you should notice that all types of intelligence tests that have been used over the years operate under a set of assumptions. One of the first big assumptions that are out there is that when we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about cognitive skill performance. So we've talked about a series of different cognitive abilities that are available. In essence, when we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about people that are really good at specific cognitive skills that we develop throughout our lifespan. And another assumption that's being made here when we talk about comparing people of similar ages to each other is that when we're looking at changes in cognitive skills, we're expecting everybody's performance to kind of develop in a very set pattern. So you're going to learn specific words before you learn other words, or you're going to learn to do spatial tasks better at a certain age, at a very specific time, and you're going to perform at this particular task at a very set rate. And that assumption of having this kind of predictable pattern of development, that everybody at the same age should be able to do the same exact things, is something that is very presumptive and a little dangerous at times when we start looking at other cultures, when we start looking at other groups of individuals. But if we're going to talk about intelligence through these means of measurement, we have to operate under these assumptions. And because of that, a lot of people in the field of developmental psychology show an interest in the idea of intelligence development, but are very, very tentative to talk about how intelligence relates to the field of development. And you're going to see this when we look at some of the implications with the development and intelligence that we're going to talk about a little bit later.